Today, I'm going to share some tips and tricks for both capturing and editing images in hazy and high contrast situations. It's just a fact of life these days that we have to deal with, so I'm going to show you some of the best ways that you can capture and edit images in those conditions. Well, hey everyone, it's Hudson. Welcome to this week's video. We're going to talk about a basic fact of life for photographers all over the world during summer and fall season when we have wildfire smoke, and that's hazy conditions. And in this particular video, I'm going to walk through an image captured on the workshop just a couple weeks ago in Glacier National Park, where we had hazy, high contrast, beautiful sunset on the Going to the Sun Highway. And, I walked everybody through how to capture all the tonality in the best possible way with our raw capture technique. And now I'm going to walk you through some cool ways to deal with the haze as you process those high contrast images. And I think it's a really good illustrative principle to keep in mind when you're out there looking at these magnificent scenes that we tend to look at dawn and sunset as outdoors landscape photographers, dealing with the conditions that we find in the wild. So without further ado, I'm just going to jump into Lightroom Classic and start showcasing some images that illustrate this. All right, so we had a really remarkable evening during our Glacier National Park workshop last month. A great crew of people, beautiful conditions. It was a little warmer than normal. We had a little bit more haze, but that did make for some spectacular sunrises and sunsets, nice warm light, a little more diffuse light. And we had just a fantastic time. So, I'm going to show you the image that we're going to talk about. This is, the epitome of a high contrast hazy scene. And it was significantly complicated to capture and get it in a way that you can present like this, where there's enough contrast and detail and it really tells this story. I have spent a lot of time scouting this region and looking for places where we could really capture the majesty that you see from the Going to the Sun Highway. And, Rick and I had sort of picked this spot out along the highway, and we got the evening during the course of this workshop. I'll set the stage a little bit, So cruising through Glacier National Park and El Jefe with the whole crew, taking them all to the east side. It's hazy. There was beautiful, beautiful light, though, and wonderful flowers, and just a great time to be out photographing and playing around in the mountains on the Montana-Canadian border there. Bald eagles and moonrises and pre-dawn blue hours and wildlife galore. It was a really great trip. But again, you've got this kind of hazy scene, and we had this one night up at the spot that we've scouted, we've thought about for sunset. There were really not a lot of clouds forecast for the week that we were running this workshop. But we went up there and talked about this location and how, the river kind of leads your eye to the mountains and the sun rims right down there in late summer. And we went out and shot it on a late evening and used some of that magical light on the surrounding scenes and sort of shot the afterglow. We did a lot of details, playing around in the woods. We had one really smoky day up at many glaciers, and we focused more on wildlife that day, although I did play around with my little Fuji X106 that I'm playing with and did this handheld pano up at Swift Current Lake. We played around in the rivers and springs. Some days were a little less hazy than others. And, when we were up in the mountains, when we were at our lookout point where I just dream of having the right sunset, I said to folks, there's going to be an evening someday when I'm up here and there are clouds and there's a gap in the clouds and they light up and we've got that magnificent sunset that I envision for this scene. And one night we were up near the pass and you saw a cloud starting to form. We were really focusing in on wildlife. And, lo and behold, I'll skip forward through some of the scenes like McDonald and whatnot, but we got up there and there were clouds and there was a gap, and that light was reflecting down on the river. And sure, it was a little bit hazy, but you could see there were clouds coming down. And this is the kind of scene where, on the light meter, I wasn't quite sure whether I was going to be able to capture everything in the tonal range, But even if so, and you can't quite see looking at the histogram on your camera because it tends to blow out a little bit left and right. You're going to see the reds blow out. You're not going to see all the tonality and range that you get with your sensor. You kind of learn your camera, but looking at the histogram, here I'm just going to open this panel. Our histogram, the right side of our histogram is pure white, the left side is pure black, the middle is neutral tones, and we're seeing colors distribution along that from the whites to the blacks with the midtones in the middle. And on your camera, you can pull up that red, green, and blue histogram and have a look at your scene. It looked pretty high contrast. If there was no haze, it would absolutely, there's no way you could capture everything in the frame. Whenever I'm shooting this kind of high contrast, in the past, in the film days, I would have dropped a graduated neutral density filter in, but you wind up with an artificial dark line, like throwing sunglasses over the top half of the image, and part of these hills would be darkened and part of them wouldn't, and there's no straight line through the middle of this scene based on contrast. So what I prefer to do these days is bracket and blend them in post-production and HDR processing. So this is the image shot on the light meter. This is the underexposed image, 3 stops underexposed, all right? And as I shot this scene and looked at it, I went through and I shot, on the meter, 3 stops underexposed, 3 stops overexposed, looking at the shadows and where they lie in the histogram, looking at the highlights and where they lie in the histogram on the underexposed frame. And it seemed to me that starting off about a stop and a third underexposed for that first frame, and then shooting one that's 4 1/3 stops underexposed, and one that's 2 1/3 stops overexposed was really the way to go. And that wound up getting me exactly the distribution of tones that I wanted. It's still sort of, you're centering on what you have set, so just build in, using manual mode, manual ISO. We're shooting here at 400 ISO because it was kind of dark and I was hand holding as I walked around working with other people in the workshop, shooting with my Nikon ZF, which has, great dynamic range, and an excellent handhold ability at slow shutter speeds like this 1/125th of a second shot. Because I wasn't on a tripod and I was moving around working with other people, I'm shooting at a little higher ISO and bracing myself and firing it as a burst. You put it in continuous capture and bap, 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 you fire all 3 frames and then look at your histogram as we talked about. Well, starting off about a stop and a third underexposed, and then bracketing 3 frames under that, 3 frames over that, was getting me the tonality that I want. Now all we have to do is blend it and then work on that haze a little bit. And I'm gonna show you some tricks for doing that. So when I go back to my grid view, I just push the G key. I could also just click this little symbol right here. If you don't see this toolbar, you can always go up to your view and say, show hide toolbar. It could be hidden. See, now it wouldn't show up. Show toolbar. The T key gets rid of that to give you more real estate for your grid. The T key toggles it. I love how they put the little shortcuts up there. So, all right. We're having a look here. What I'm going to do is, I haven't touched these images at all. I'm going to grab all 3 of them. All right. And if you wanted, you could apply super resolution to each of these before you start this process, and that would take them from 24 megapixels to 96 megapixels each. I'm not going to go through that right now. It would just slow the whole process down. But if you want the highest possible quality, you got a nice sharp image like this, you might think about it. What I'm going to do is I've got all 3 of them selected, and I'm going to right click them and say photo merge. All right, I'm here in the library. I'm not even in develop. I'm going to select photo merge and I'm going to say HDR. And what's going to happen is it's going to blend all of the tonality of those 3 images, image wide, not like dropping a graduated filter and saying I want the top half to be underexposed and the bottom half more exposed. So boom, all right, we've got this. You can choose to set auto settings or not. It might look kind of flat. I'm going to go ahead. I always toggle this just to see how good a job is Lightroom Classic doing at toning this. Well, that's a pretty nice start. It's doing a pretty good job with shadows and highlights and pulling this all together. And since I'm handheld, I'm definitely going to click on Align Images here. And sometimes I ask, let's see the deghosting overlay. It looks like the clouds are moving a little bit up in here. Probably nothing major going on with deghosting. It's not like things are moving that much. I don't see a lot of movement. Yeah, I think that's fine. I usually go low or medium, sometimes none, but low or medium for handheld is a good idea, I think. That's just making sure that anything that's moving between the 3 frames gets aligned and cued off of one of them. And I'm going to go ahead and click merge. And what's going to happen, I had it clicked to create a stack. I've already stacked these and coded them yellow. Yellow to me means an HDR capture. And boom, there we go. It stacks them. All those base images are still there, but I have this new DNG file created from my 3 raw Nikon NEF files that is an HDR file. All right, and so you can see its title now is down here, written down here. When I hover over it, is the same file name as one of those 3 files with HDR, and it's a DNG file. It's a linear file wrapped in Adobe's raw wrapper, let's call it file wrapper, DNG. So I'm going to go ahead and take that file into develop now. And this is where we'll have some fun. Okay, so you can see there are some adjustments that have been made. I chose that auto setting. All right, it's added vibrance. I don't know if I want to add vibrance at this point. I can go in here and tweak and adjust these things as I want, right? I could boost shadows more, all right? I could boost contrast more. But I really want to do this in a way that's going to reduce the haze. And I know a lot of people's tendency is to just go ahead and grab this dehaze slider, right, and start pulling it. And yeah, that does stuff, but look, it's doing things to contrast. It's doing a lot of micro sharpening. It's doing things that can tend, once you start going into edit to print, to cause some issues with, shall I say artifacts and things that pop up in the editing process down the road. And I think it tends to look a little heavy-handed. To me, I like a much more natural look. This is a hazy scene. I just want to add contrast. You know, we live in an age where we have smoky summers in the Mountain West, and this is an example of that. So I'm going to show you a technique that I played around with during this workshop. I'm going to open my histogram panel so I can see what I'm working with here. And I'm going to go ahead to my masking controls. That's this little circle with the dashed line around it. And what I want to do is I want to open up a luminance range mask. And that's going to let me select the brighter part of the image or the darker part of the image, a group of tones, all right? And I want to exclude the darker part of the image. So I'm going to grab this little slider, and the slider is keyed to the histogram. You see, left side is black, right side is white. And I'm going to start excluding the shadows. All right, so you see the forest in the foreground drops out, and I start kind of pushing back up into the more hazy part of our image, all right? Something up in here. And I actually want to take it to where I'm really only just looking at the brighter part of my scene. And then you'll notice there's this little tab right there. We can actually grab, sometimes it's hard to get which one you want. There it is. That is a feather. And as you can see, I'm feathering that effect in. I'm saying I want a real gradual, slow blend from not affecting the image to affecting the image. And you can see I'm working to where it's a really slow feather that kind of matches the haze, right? And I can move this feather. You can see it can go from a soft edge to a hard edge. We want the brighter part of our scene, the very brightest part up here in the clouds in the sky. But I want to exclude some of the darker part of the scene, but I want it to feather in the same way that the haze does into the woods as we're looking into the distance. And that works really well for these backlit, sunset, hazy scenes. All of a sudden, it also works in really bright daylit scenes as I've played around with it. And you might ask, well, you know, what's the difference between that and select sky? Pretty significant. In a scene like this, select sky tends to do kind of a bad job. And you wouldn't want to be trying to darken just that with that edge. You can see this is just not going to work. I'm going to go ahead and hit delete. We're going to stick with this mask that I just created. And what do we do with it now, right? Well, what we can do right off the bat is start pulling the highlights back a bit, all right? And we can take contrast up a little bit. And we can take the blacks. Watch this. There's no blacks in that part of the frame. And by pulling the blacks down, what I'm doing is increasing contrast in the midtones and the brighter part of the image. I'm sort of, you watch the entire midtones, highlights, and shadows start just getting kind of crushed down into a little bit darker, more contrasty part of the image. And all of a sudden that stuff starts to pop a little bit, all right? And I might not want to add as much contrast. I can kind of go forward and back with that a little bit. I can pull my highlights back just a smidge more if I want. Let's have a look at what shadows do, either brightening them or darkening them. I actually kind of like darkening them just a little bit, right? That looks really good. So all of a sudden, we're getting a lot more kind of contrast. We might actually boost exposure throughout our scene just a little bit and then boost contrast a little bit more. We're not blowing any highlights out at this point. And so we're tonally tweaking this without really working with saturation or micro contrast or sharpening at all, really, right? All right, so, and now what we can do is play around with this again. You know, do we want to, oh, there you go. You can see how just increasing that feather, as I'm saying, bring some more of this scene into my mask, all right? Yeah, I can really sort of play around with that a bit and get it looking just like I want. All right, and then I could also, watch this, I could say duplicate and invert. And now what we're gonna have is the opposite mask. Now we can start playing with our shadows and boosting those a little bit without really boosting anything in the background. And what I might do is say, I would like this to be even more ranged in. See, as I play with that feather, I want that line to come in even a little bit more. I want to exclude more of those shadows so that we're working less on this inner area right here. So as I pull that back right to the edge of where we can go, it's starting to just really only work with the darker shadows in the scene. And I can boost those shadows a bit. That's that foreground woods, right? And then bring our contrast up in there just a little bit. Let's start to pop, all right? So I haven't touched Dehaze at all at this point. I've got a couple of different masks active, just differentially toning the whole scene. You know, now I can back off shadows a little bit if I want to. I can boost contrast globally just a touch if I want to. Get this thing really looking how I want. And then, you know, a thing I might consider now is where I might just look at just a little tiny bit of dehaze. I'm not going to do very much, just a little tiny bit, just to add, look at that, 8. I'm not going to go any more than that. As I zoom in here, I'm not seeing any edge artifacts. It looks pretty good. All right, it looks really good. It looks hazy, but beautiful. Now, personally, for me, the longer I go in photography, the less I like, you know, kind of oversaturation. So I'm going to go in here, and I've been playing around with the color mixer, and for a long time I've argued we'll run back to the mixer, the traditional HSL settings. But my good friend Sandy on this workshop said, hey, you should start playing around with that point color more. It is pretty cool. And so the way point color is, you come over here and you can see a really nice detail of what color am I selecting, especially in that little zoomed in blow up. All right, I'm picking that color of orange. It shows me what it is. And then I can play with the hue, saturation, and luminance right here. This is kind of cooler than the targeted adjustment tool in my opinion. So I could just take the saturation and shift it back just a little. I don't want to overdo it, just a little. See, it was looking a little unnatural to me. A little more than I'd normally think of. So I'm just backing it off like that much. And then I could grab that same eyedropper again and say, let's play around with the greens in our scene, this forest of trees down here, and let's boost their luminance. Let's make those trees a little bit brighter. Oh, look at that. Boom. All right. I could make them more or less saturated. I could make them more green, less yellow. I can play around with the hue or the saturation. What I just really wanted was to brighten up the greens in the scene just a little bit. All right. Then kind of a final, oh, I didn't mean to open masking, I just mean to close the color mixer. One of the really cool things that we've got that's newer in Lightroom is it's more of a beta kind of feature, is the remove power that we have in Photoshop is coming into Lightroom. And so one thing that I've been playing around with a little bit is this remove tool. And you can say, you know, to do object aware generative AI, okay? And you need to be connected to the internet like with Photoshop to do this, but let's do some generative AI. You know, as I said, I was hand-holding, working with workshop students, and I really didn't notice this one tree is just a little bit distracting. If I wanted to get rid of that, I'm just curious, you know, we're here in a completely raw file. and we go ahead and say apply. Well, let's see what happens, just out of curiosity. If I click off of that, let's just turn off the thing. Wow, that did a pretty great job. It looked like it put a little treetop down here. Crazy. That works for me. You know, you could probably go in and zap it again if you wanted to get rid of that, but I think it's just nicer. It's not a big obstruction reaching up into the frame, kind of distracting me down in the corner. It actually kind of completes that line. It's like the generative AI did a really nice job with that. And there you have it, right? I might go in and just use the object selection with masking. I won't go through and do it all with you, but I might go through or just brush a little bit along the river and pop the highlights a little bit. But wow, you know, one of the things that I'll say too, you know, people might say, well, it looked to me as if you had all the tonality in that one frame. But in that one frame, let's go back and have a look at those 3 frames that we were working with. In that one frame, where we had all the highlights and shadows captured as the camera saw it, yeah, you can see we've got a little bit of the sun is blown, not a big deal. I could probably recover that pretty easily with just a quick pull of highlights, or maybe the whites, or maybe exposure. You know, I mean, it is the sun, so that it's not a big deal to have that as a specular highlight. But when we do the 3 stops underexposed, all of a sudden we have all that tonality in the sun and the sky in a beautiful, easily editable way. It recovers those highlights in that section of the frame. And it would be even more important if there were less haze between us and the sun. But what's even more important, honestly, is this overexposed frame where you can see we've lost all of the sky and most of the detail on the mountains. You know, if you were to try to pull that back, it's gonna look pretty ugly, right? That's just a blob of white up there. But what we have is a nicely exposed woods down here that's all sort of in shadows and midtones, and that gives us the ability, when we blend all the tonality of these 3 frames, the on the meter, the 3 stops underexposed, the 3 stops overexposed, we have that tonality frame wide, so as we pull up shadows, we're not going to be generating noise as if they were crushed down into the blacks like they were in this super underexposed frame, or this one. This one, those are pretty dark. It's down here in the blacks is the forest if you're looking at the scene. So having that section of the image taken into shadows and highlights from black, or shadows and midtones from blacks, enables us to tone this in a way that we really don't get noise and a loss of detail down here in the forest. And at the same time, we're getting that beautiful sky up above, and we don't have some artificial line from a graduated neutral density filter, and we barely touch the dehaze slider at all to get the look that we're after by using that gradient mask, or it's not really a gradient mask, it's the luminance range. Luminance range mask is a really powerful tool. It's essentially luminosity masking on your raw file. And the ability to do this all with the raw data that we're capturing in our camera is just mind-boggling, just mind-boggling. So there you have it. You know, I think that example image is a great way of talking about how to handle high contrast scenes and haze in our landscape imagery. You know, more and more haze is just becoming a reality for those of us working summertime, fall, in many, many places of the world. And the dehaze slider can be tempting, but I think that it's a more nuanced way to go ahead and use that luminance range masking that you've got in Lightroom. And also, you know, if you haven't been playing around with HDR, you can capture just those 3 frames in almost any situation where you have high contrast and capture all the highlight, tone, and shadow detail in really nice, rich, juicy, editable, raw data that's more in the shadows, midtones, highlights instead of the whites and the blacks, which is going to lead to better image quality throughout the frame without the kind of superimposed, unnatural line that you get using a graduated filter in the field. I really think graduated filters tend to do more harm than good these days, especially when we have the ability to just capture all the tonality through the range and incorporate that all into one master file so easily now. All right, everybody. So we'll be doing another set of office hours, open Q&A. Sign up for those right over at hudsonhenry.com/office hours. You can click right here. Links to all the gear that I use, recommend, and stand by are always at hudsonhenry.com/ATS links. And you can click for those right here as well. I want to thank everyone for all the support and the questions and the great comments that you have coming in, and using my links and shopping in my store. It really supports all the fun work that we do working with photographers and learning and practicing this great art that we're all on the pathway getting better at. So I hope you're out there enjoying practicing, honing those skills, staying safe. We'll see you next week.